You are listening to Lesson 4, Chapter 1 of Form 4 African History. Cameroon General Education. Narrated by Wacheseh Academy. Africa and the Second World War and the Growth of African Nationalism. Reasons for African involvement in the Second World War. Italy declared war against the Allied powers in 1940. This influenced the Allied powers to extend the war to Italian African colonies. To assist the dethroned Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia to liberate his country from Italian control. Allied powers wanted to defend their North African possessions against the Axis powers. To prevent the Axis powers from making use of the oil resources in North Africa against the Allied powers. To prevent the seizure of the Suez Canal in Egypt by the Axis powers in order not to obstruct British passage to the Far East. The Allied powers needed soldiers and goods from Africa in the war against the Axis. To prevent the Germans from regaining their former African territories. To get rid of the German spies and collaborated in Africa, who were mobilizing support for the Germans against the Allied. How it was fought in Africa. The Italian troops from Italian Somaliland invaded British Somaliland, and Italian troops from Libya attacked Egypt in September 1940. The British forces commanded by Wavell drove the Italian forces from the Egyptian borders back to Benghazi in 1941. By August 1994, the East African British troops liberated British Somaliland and Abyssinian, and Haile Selassie were restored. In 1942, a brilliant German General Rommel nicknamed the Desert Fox drove the British from Libya, but brilliant British General Enchinlek retook Libya. In May 1942, General Rommel received extra supplies and drove the British forces from Libya and moved deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and the Gulf oil fields. The new British General Montgomery received extra supplies and defeated the Germans in the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. The war was also extended to French Equatorial Africa. The Free French movement of General Charles de Gaulle and the British forces topped the pro-German Vichy regime of Richard Bruno in Cameroon in 1940. The role played by Africans. Africa provided soldiers that assisted the Allied powers to defeat the Axis powers in Italy and Germany, in North Africa. The Japanese in the Far East liberation of France in 1944. They provided military bases for war operations. The Allied powers used Egypt to check the Axis powers in North Africa. They supplied European industries with essential raw materials. They provided food for Europeans during the war. They acted as spies during the Second World War in North Africa and French Equatorial Africa. They helped Europeans with useful information against the Axis powers. They gave financial assistance to the Allied powers through taxes and financial contributions. They helped the Axis powers by spreading anti-Axis propaganda and mobilized most of the people against the Axis powers. They also played the role of interpreters and translators. They played the roles of porters during the war. Africans served the European soldiers as laborers. African hosted important wartime confer in January 1943. In which President Roosevelt of the USA and Prime Minister Churchill of Britain planned to stack and conquer Italy. Effects of World War II in Africa. Positive effects. Political. The myth of white superiority was shattered. The war brought Africans close to Europeans, and they discovered that Europeans were not superior in intelligence, behavior, or bravery. The war made the Africans come in contact with Western European liberal ideas or literature which helped them to challenge European colonialism. It trained the Africans on the use of modern weapons, etc. It contributed to the liberation of Italian East Africa with the help of the Allied forces. It made Europeans promise Africans independence after the war as compensation for their war efforts. It led to the transformation of mandated territory to trust territories. The war exhausted the colonial masters and weakened their control over African colonies. It led to the decline of Western Europe and the rise of superpowers, the USA and USSR, that gave moral and material assistance to the Africans to secure independence. The war had also made Roosevelt of the USA and Churchill of Britain produce the Atlantic Charter, which supported the right of people to live under a freely chosen government. It led to the destruction of the League and the birth of the UNO. A more realistic international organization was determined to help the Africans achieve independence, as well as promoting economic and social development. It made European powers like France opposed to the independence of African colonies to change their anti-colonial policies, mainly because of the role played by Africans in the liberation of France. Economic effects. Africans gained jobs in the colonial army. Europeans opened small-scale industries in Africa to cater for emergency needs, which also benefited the Africans. The war forced the Europeans to expanded ports roads in Africa. It led to an increase in demand for tropical raw materials, which created a trade boom. The social and economic hardship brought about by the war influenced the Africans to establish trade unions to bargain for better working conditions. Social effects. The increase in African export as a result of the war led to the increase in African income that enabled the Africans to live in better houses, educate their children, feed properly, etc. It contributed to the growth of African towns because towns provided more job opportunities during the war. Many Africans had the privilege of visiting many European cities, and this helped to broaden their scope. Some Africans returned home with European women, and this helped to reduce the inferiority complex of the Africans in front of Europeans. Negative effects. Political. African ex-servicemen were appointed after the war because Europeans did not fulfill the promises of immediate independence and improvement of the welfare of the people. Soldiers returned from Europe to Africa with arms which they used in terrorizing the people. Soldiers returned with Western ideas which disrupted the old pattern of village organization. Social. The war led to a mass movement to the cities, leading to congestion and social ills like banditry, prostitution, etc. African lost prominent soldiers as a direct result of the war. It caused food problems since food was requisitioned to feed the army in some places. More emphasis was on cash crops. The war made African soldiers be separated from their families. Economic. Inflation and high cost of living caused by a scarcity of essential goods, because of wartime priority on such things as armament. It led to forced labor adopted by the European masters to produce essential tropical raw materials for their industries. Africans suffered destruction of roads, bridges, and railways, especially in North Africa where the war was seriously fought. The war influenced the Africans to contribute finances to support the war efforts of the Allied powers, and this was a burden to African peasants.